Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you so much for being with me today. And as we begin today's episode, I just pray that you are in a place where you feel the closeness of God. I pray that you're dwelling in God's shadow. I pray that you're chasing after God. I pray that you're seeking God. I pray that you're pursuing God. I pray that you hear His voice. I pray that you feel His presence near to you, because that makes all the difference in the world. And as we've identified on our journey through the Power of Purity podcast, that it's our relationship with God ultimately that creates the possibility of the deepest healing and redemption of our lives. So God bless you, and just thank you for being here with me today. If you were with me last week, you know that I began a little series that I'm calling The Human Brain, Neuroplasticity, and Porn Addiction. And I started the episode last week with a gigantic disclaimer, because I freely admit that at the very best, I'm like in kindergarten on this stuff. I am not an expert. I sense and I believe and I have a kind of intuition that this concept is incredibly important, what's going on in the human brain and how it is foundational to addictive behavior. And if we're going to change the power that sex has held over us, we're going to have to understand what's going on in our brain and what we can do to, in a sense, reprogram our brain or create new pathways in our brain so that we're not enslaved to the old patterns that we've been enslaved to for so long. But there is good news, and the good news is that this is very possible, and it concerns this idea of neuroplasticity, which means that the brain can be changed, that new pathways can be created in the brain. So I'm picturing right now just the concept of concrete, that when they pour a new concrete patio in the back of your house, and sometimes what people do when the concrete is fresh and it's just poured is they have their kids put their feet or their hands in the wet concrete, and of course it makes an imprint in the soft concrete. And then in a short matter of time, the concrete gets hard, and then that handprint or that footprint is actually embedded in that concrete. And you could come back 10 years later and it's still there because it's embedded. Well, that's not how the human brain works. The human brain is not like concrete, that something gets embedded in it and then it hardens in such a way that it can never, ever be changed. Because of the neuroplasticity of the brain is like more soft than hard. So even though a pattern's been there for a very long time, maybe years and years and years, as I gave that metaphor last week, each time it rains, the water goes in that rivulet and makes that groove in the ground deeper and deeper and deeper, and that happens in the human brain. These pathways become established in the brain, but the fact is, it's not like concrete, and that it can never ever change, because we're learning that these old pathways can actually be disrupted and interrupted and confused and disoriented in such a way that the brain can then begin to create a new pathway because of neuroplasticity. It's not hard like concrete. It's pliable and soft, so that a new pathway can be created, and you can begin to create a new rivulet and a new groove and a new pathway, which creates hope and possibility of something very different in your life. And that's totally awesome. So I am not Tony Ingrassia, brain surgeon. I am Tony Ingrassia with a kindergarten understanding of the human brain and neuroplasticity. As I said last week, I am about the business of trying to get an expert, a brain expert on the Power of Purity podcast so we can get some real significant understanding and information and framework to how kind of some of this stuff works. But in the meantime, I'm just doing my best. So you're stuck with Tony and his Tonyisms and his kindergartenisms as I try to explain this the best I can. So today I wanted to share with you something that I think is a very, very important part of this puzzle, and it has to do with what I would call the 4 major feel-good chemicals of the human brain. And there's an acronym for these 4 feel-good chemicals of the brain, and this acronym is DOSE, D-O-S-E. And so these 4 chemicals are number 1, dopamine, number 2, oxytocin, number 3, serotonin, and number 4, endorphins. And so I want to talk a little bit about each one of those again with my kindergarten explanations of each one. But let me say this before I begin to try to talk about each separate chemical. There's a sense in which each one of these contribute in a significant way to feelings of pleasure and happiness and satisfaction. And there's one primary word attached to each chemical, and I want to just say it this way. Number 1 is dopamine, and dopamine in one word is the chemical of pleasure. So anytime you feel any kind of pleasure, it's because dopamine is being released in your brain. Number 2 is oxytocin, and in one word, the key word there is bonding. So any sense of bonding in your relationship, affection, or hugging, or touch, or empathy, bonding is created by oxytocin release in your brain. Number 3 is serotonin, and that has to do with your mood. So anytime you have a sense of an elevated mood or you're feeling good, it has to do with the fact that serotonin is being released in your brain, and that is what causes you to have the mood that you have. And number 4 is endorphins, and in one word, the word there would be satisfaction. So anytime you feel a sense of satisfaction or completion, I'm satisfied, I feel good about this, that's because endorphins are being released. So just try to picture for a moment how significant these 4 chemicals are working together in your brain: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And together, these 4 feel-good chemicals are causing you to have a sense of pleasure, a sense of bonding, a sense of an elevated mood or feeling good, and a sense of satisfaction. So you can see how these 4 dynamics are working together and how important they are in the kind of mood we have and how we're feeling about ourselves and how much pleasure or happiness we're actually experiencing in our life. So let me see if I can just talk about each one of these 4 feel-good chemicals a little bit. I did just a little bit of preliminary research, and so again, I'm just kind of giving you guys some very basic information. The first feel-good chemical is dopamine. Dopamine is the main chemical of pleasure in your body. So nearly all pleasurable experiences that you ever have are related to dopamine because dopamine is being released in your brain. So if you have a good meal, you put something in your mouth and it tastes good and, oh man, this is so good, and it gives you a sense of pleasure. That pleasure is being derived because dopamine is being released in your brain. Or if you get a raise at work, a pay raise, or somebody gives you a compliment, hey, you look nice today, or wow, that's a nice suit, or that's a nice dress, your hair really looks nice today. That compliment makes you feel good. And the reason it feels good is because when that compliment came to you, dopamine was released in your brain. Or let's say you're driving down the road and a song comes on the radio, one of your favorite songs, and without even realizing, you begin to tap your foot, and that song just makes you feel good. There's like this little rush. It's because dopamine is released in your brain. Or a student gets an A on their paper, an alcoholic's driving down the street and he sees a bar on the corner, and he gets this little sense of anticipation or pleasure. There's this sense of adrenaline. That's because dopamine is released in his brain. A person has a wandering eye and they see a hot prospect and they feel this sense of pleasure, like, wow, it's because dopamine was released. A video game player wins the next level in their video game, and they have this sense of pleasure, achievement, accomplishment. It feels so good because when they got that next level, dopamine was released. If you've ever worked hard to reach a goal, the satisfaction that you feel when you achieve that goal is partly due to a rush of dopamine in your brain. And by the way, depression is linked to the dysfunction of a person's dopamine system. So if for some reason dopamine is not being released or it's not being processed properly in the brain, it diminishes a person's ability to feel pleasure. And therefore, it makes sense why a person who is not experiencing dopamine the way they're intended to would be inclined toward depression. And that's why antidepressants are used so often for the purpose of fighting depression. Because so often what the antidepressant does is it's actually designed to cause the human brain to process dopamine more efficiently and effectively, so that if we get the dopamine flowing in your brain, you're going to feel pleasure, you're going to feel better, and therefore you're not going to be depressed. And that's essentially what antidepressants are doing for your brain. And we're going to talk just a little bit more about that in a moment when we talk about serotonin. But the second feel-good or happy chemical in the brain is oxytocin, and it concerns the concept of human bonding, a sense of bonding. Oxytocin is the feeling of love. If you feel love, if you're in love with somebody, or you look at your grandchild and you just, you feel so much love, that's because oxytocin in your brain is being released, and that's what undergirds that sense of bonding, that feeling of love, or the feeling of trust or empathy. And oxytocin is central to relationship, human relationship, and the dynamics of relationship between people, so that when people actually touch each other physically, it feels good because oxytocin is released in your brain. Or when you hug a person that you love, or you feel affection, when you kiss another person, or express intimacy in other ways, or when you become sexually involved with another person, sexual activity, all of these things cause oxytocin to be released in your brain and your system, and it undergirds this sense of bonding. And one little interesting vignette that I found here in 2012, some researchers were doing this project, and they reported that people in the first stages of romantic attachment have higher levels of oxytocin in their system compared to non-attached single people or couples that have been together for a prolonged period of time. So in other words, it might be like the stage of puppy love or first love or infatuation. It's like when I first meet you, I feel these feelings of affection and love and attachment and bonding, and I'm falling in love. So massive amounts of oxytocin are being released, and that's what actually causes two people to be attracted to each other and to have this sense of bonding. And that these strong levels or higher levels of oxytocin are recorded in young couples or young relationships for the first 6 months to a year after people meet. So I just thought that that was very interesting. And that brings us to the third happy chemical, which is serotonin. And again, the concept attached to serotonin is mood, the word mood. It's serotonin that affects a person's mood and actually regulates the kind of mood that they're in. So when serotonin levels are normal, people feel happier. They feel calm. They feel more focused. They might feel less anxious. They feel more emotionally stable. And one study that was released in 2007 found that people with depression typically have low levels of serotonin. So therefore their mood is depressed. They don't feel good. It makes sense that they would be inclined toward depression because they have diminished levels of serotonin, which is diminishing their mood. And serotonin deficiency has also been linked to anxiety and insomnia in many people. And by the way, speaking of Tony being a kindergarten teacher, I'm really in the deep end of the water here, so I'm not sure I can talk about this very well. But just a few moments ago, when I was talking about the first happy chemical in the brain, dopamine, and I mentioned that the suppression of dopamine often contributes to the proclivity of a person to be depressed, and therefore a primary function of antidepressants is to stimulate a person's dopamine system, so that if dopamine is increased in their brain and in their system, they're going to feel better because dopamine creates a sense of pleasure. So a primary function of many of the antidepressants are what's called SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. SSRIs include Prozac and Zoloft, for example, which are typical antidepressants used to help depressed people feel better. But just notice the name of that term, SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So the SSRIs function in such a way that they cause your brain to be able to process serotonin in a more effective way. So again, I'm not saying this good. It's like I'm in kindergarten, but imagine this. Serotonin is floating around in your brain, these serotonin chemicals. But for some reason, your brain is not processing the serotonin. And serotonin undergirds your mood. It makes you feel better. Makes you feel happier, makes you feel more calm, helps you feel to relax, it helps you feel good about yourself. But the serotonin isn't flowing good in your brain. And there are these things in your brain that are called uptake receptors. So I'm picturing in my own kindergarten metaphor, imagine if there were like these vacuum cleaner hoses in your brain. So the serotonin chemicals are floating around, which are going to help you feel better, have a better mood. But for some reason, the vacuum cleaners aren't on. So they're not sucking up the serotonin in your brain. So what the SSRI does, what the antidepressant does, is it causes your brain to uptake the serotonin. So when you take the antidepressant, it like turns on the vacuum cleaners in your brain. So now they're sucking up the serotonin, which is processing the serotonin through your brain, which elevates your mood and makes you feel better and makes you feel happier, makes you feel better about yourself. And therefore, your depression goes away because serotonin is being processed properly through your brain and through your system. So there's my very basic kindergarten explanation of what serotonin is doing in the brain. And that brings us to the fourth happy or feel-good chemical of the human brain, which is endorphins. And endorphins are associated with the concept of satisfaction or being satisfied. Endorphins provide brief euphoria to mask physical pain. Endorphins are actually released in your brain in response to a sense of pain or distress. So endorphins are actually designed to block pain. So when your brain senses, oh, my body's feeling pain, something hurts over there, so I'm going to let some endorphins loose in the brain, which will help to block or diminish that sense of pain that we're feeling right now. So endorphins are what cause this phenomenon that's commonly referred to as a runner's high. This is caused by endorphins. Or said another way, if a person's out running, let's say a marathon, or you're going to run 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 miles, and after you've run so far, you're exerting your body, and after a while, your body's going to rebel against you and begin to get tired and begin to hurt and begin to feel pain, and it's not getting enough oxygen, or your body's feeling exhausted, so your body starts to feel pain. So your body is going to want to seek to neutralize this pain or block the pain. So your brain's going to say, okay, let's release some endorphins here. So your brain floods with endorphins, and these endorphins create this sense of satisfaction. That's what they do. They actually block pain. They create kind of a sense of pleasure. And that's why all of a sudden, the runner on his 7th or 8th mile, when he's been feeling pain and he feels like, I can't do this, and all of a sudden he hits this plateau and he gets like this rush of adrenaline and he feels good and he kind of breaks through that wall. It's the runner's high. He feels good. Man, I can keep going. And all of a sudden he's empowered to continue to run. It's because his brain has released endorphins, which are making him feel good because the pain is being blocked. And by the way, when a person laughs, your brain releases endorphins. And here's an interesting fact, you guys. I thought this was fascinating, and I'll try to say it the best I can. But the pharmacological name of endorphins, or the etymology of the word itself, is broke down in 2 parts, endo and orphan. And what these 2 words mean, the etymology of the words, they're short forms of the words endogenous and morphine. And endogenous, I believe, means something that's created inside of you or within the body. And of course, one of the primary purposes of morphine is to block pain. So this word endorphin, endo-orphin, or endogenous morphine, or in other words, morphine that's being created within your own body or within your brain. So endorphins are like your body's answer to morphine. It's your body's attempt or your body's ability to create a chemical that blocks pain and makes you feel good, and thus the sense of satisfaction that you derive. So with all that said, you guys, this little review of these 4 happy or feel-good chemicals, let me share just a few thoughts in response. And I'd advocate, guys, that it's actually the release of these 4 happy, feel-good chemicals that are at the epicenter and foundational to the concept of addictive behavior and addiction. Because as I tried to speak to in the last episode, the neuroplasticity of the brain, when the brain feels the release or the flood of these 4 happy chemicals, the brain intuitively begins to crave that. The brain likes the flow of those 4 chemicals, so it's as if the brain says to itself, let's do this again, and let's do it again, let's do it again. Ooh, these endorphins and this dopamine and this serotonin feels so good. Give me some more, give me some more. Brain, release some more. So that thing that you did to get that burst of dopamine, do it again, do it again, do it again. And so a person begins to intuitively reach out and pull that trigger over and over again that is releasing these 4 happy chemicals. And because of the brain's neuroplasticity then, each time that rain cloud goes over your head and those feel-good chemicals are released, there's like this rush of these chemicals, and they flow down the rivulet of your brain, and that pathway gets deeper and deeper, and it gets reinforced. And thus that particular behavior or activity is reinforced, and a person begins to crave that even more and more and more. And I think this helps us understand what is actually going on underneath the addiction, you guys. Or maybe here's a way to say it. I think in a very real way, it's fair to say that a person does not have a porn addiction. It's not that you're actually addicted to the porn. What you really have is you have a drug addiction in a very real way, because your brain is releasing these chemicals that make you feel good and make you feel this sense of euphoria, or in the verbiage of the 4 words that I identified, it makes you feel this combination of intense pleasure and bonding. It elevates your mood and gives you a sense of satisfaction, and then your body craves that over and over again. And so like any other drug addict, right, you want the next hit. You want your drug again and again and again. So I think it's fair to say that in a way, I realized I'm not really addicted to porn. I'm addicted to the drugs in my head that are released when I look at the porn. So it's not actually the porn itself. The porn is like a trigger. But when I look at the porn, it releases those chemicals, and those chemicals are so powerful. And that's what causes the addiction. So it's not that I'm smoking a drug, like a marijuana cigarette, or I'm not shooting a drug through a needle into my body, but in much the same way, I'm literally a drug addict, because my brain is releasing these drugs, these chemicals over and over again that create this sensation and this euphoria and this rush and this adrenaline that my brain then wants over and over again. And guys, I think there's a whole lot more that can be said about all of this. And obviously, I'm just kind of stumbling through this the best I can. I'm not sure I'm doing a very good job. But I am going to try to get us a brain expert that's going to help us understand this stuff in a much better way. And there's more that can be said about it, but I see that I'm out of time for today's episode. But I wanted to share a scripture with you guys here that I think is very intriguing. And when I share this, you guys might think I'm nuts. You might already think I'm nuts, but I really have a concept here, and I believe that I have a proof text. And I think this concept is incredibly powerful. And so I'm going to close today's episode with my idea, and I'm just bouncing it off you, so see what you think. So I'm reading here a scripture from Proverbs chapter 5, verse 15 through 20. And if I had to give this scripture a title, I'd give it the title, Drunk on Love. I believe that God actually wants us to be drunk on love, okay? So here's what it says, and he's speaking, of course, to husbands, and really he's talking about the concept of sexual exclusivity, that we should aim our sexual gift exclusively at our wife, that she should be the sole object of our sexual delight and passion and love. And so he begins in Proverbs 5, verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? And so I want to bring our attention to this word intoxicated, which appears in the passage 2 times. And I think it's a very powerful, significant, profound word with significant implications. And he says in verse 19 that you should be satisfied with the breast of your wife, and you should be intoxicated by her love, and you should not be intoxicated with the love of another woman. And so I looked up that word intoxicated in the Hebrew, and the original word literally means to be intoxicated, to reel, R-E-E-L, to waver or to fall back as from a blow. In other words, if somebody punched you in the face and you fell backwards, or to be staggered. So in other words, picture a drunk guy who's really drunk walking across the parking lot from the bar. He's stumbling, he's staggering, he's falling forward and backward and sideways. He's intoxicated. That's what the word literally means, intoxicated. It means to waver, to fall back, as if someone's punched you, to stagger. So when he says here, be intoxicated by her love, I want to tell you guys, I'm not sure that that's metaphorical in nature. I think it might be literal in nature. And here's what I mean. When you understand what's going on in the human brain, and you understand the purpose and the function and the dynamics and the power of these 4 happy chemicals, these 4 feel-good chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, and how they work together to create this intense sense of pleasure, this intense sense of bonding, and elevated mood and feel-good and satisfaction. When these 4 chemicals are released in the brain, and there's this rush of adrenaline, it's a kind of intoxication. And it feels so good and so overwhelming. It's as if you begin to waver and stagger. It's like I'm intoxicated. And he's saying here, that's the way we should be with our wife, intoxicated by her love. In other words, when I turn and I look at my wife, and I'm enraptured by her, her beauty, her body, and I'm attracted to her, and in this moment, my brain is releasing these huge amounts of these 4 feel-good chemicals. And especially at the moment of orgasm, there is literally an explosion of dopamine and oxytocin and these things in the human brain. And it's overwhelming. It's like being intoxicated. It's like being drunk. He's saying, be drunk on your wife's love. In other words, release these chemicals with your wife. Be with her and let her be the sense of your pleasure and your bonding and your elevated mood and your satisfaction. I think God wants us to be intoxicated. And I want to give a little personal testimony. And I don't know if you guys can relate to this or if you think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you, I understand this because I feel like it's not metaphorical to me. It's not just words. I have experienced this. And do you know what I'm talking about, guys? When you're with your wife and you're enraptured with your wife and you're having this beautiful, powerful, intimate, loving, connected, transparent experience. It's like I tried to talk about in that session a long time ago in that podcast episode, Electric Sex, that in these moments of rapture that we become intoxicated. And I'm telling you guys that I literally physically feel faint in my head. I feel dizzy. I feel a sense of being dizzy. Like I start to wobble. I'm intoxicated. I'm obeying Proverbs 5:19. I'm being intoxicated with my wife's love because when I'm with her, it's like my brain is so happy. It's exploding with dopamine and oxytocin, and it makes me intoxicated. It overwhelms me in such a way that I literally begin to stagger and to fall and to feel dizzy because of my wife's love. So I just believe that God intends for us to be drunk on love with our spouse. And it speaks of the wonderful, beautiful, incredible, awesome, mysterious, incomprehensible gift that God intends for sex to be. How wonderful it is, how beautiful it is, how delicious it is, how much pleasure it gives us. The bonding, the mood, the elevated mood, the sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that we derive when we are intoxicated with our wife's love. Praise be to God. So with that said, you guys, I'm way over time. I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for being with me for today's episode, and I will look forward to seeing you right back here next week at the Power of Purity podcast, and we will be blessed by God as we continue to pursue God on the pathway of purity. Have a great week. Have a great day. Be blessed. In Jesus' name, bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.